today. Once again, we're following this story as it pertains to Luigi Mangione. You might recognize that name. He's the man who's accused of gunning down United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson last December in New York City. Well, he's back in court today. This is for a series of hearings over which evidence will be allowed during his trial. We know that Mangione's attorneys are now arguing that certain evidence should be excluded from this upcoming trial on the state murder charges. This because of how they claim the evidence was obtained. The prosecution, though, is expected to call up more than 24 witnesses in this case, as these hearings are expected to last several days. So to talk a lot more about what's unfolding, I want to bring into the conversation former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Neama, thanks so much for being with us here on Live Now from Fox, talking about this. Of course, something we've been following in every detail since the manhunt first started last December after United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was gunned down. But focusing on what's going on and why we're in the courtroom today, there have been some questions about the evidence, what can be admitted, what should be admitted. In fact, there was even a question about whether or not Luigi Mangione's Miranda rights were read to him as he was being arrested. Can you sort of go into what we're seeing as well?
Christina, this is an important multi-day evidentiary hearing, a suppression hearing, where the defense is trying to suppress some of the evidence seized and some of the statements made by Luigi Mangione in violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, respectively. So there's a lot of specific questioning as to what happened and when it happened. And I'll start with the Fourth Amendment. Under the Fourth Amendment, law enforcement, they do have the right to conduct a Terry stop. That's what's considered a stop and frisk. And for that, they can ascertain someone's identity and pat them down for weapons. So that's what happened first. So we're seeing stills here of the surveillance footage from that McDonald's in Pennsylvania. There were customers who believed that the person at that McDonald's was the person that they had seen in the videos killing United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. They informed the store manager, who called 911. Officers showed up. So that first step is to ascertain Mangione's identity. And at the time, he allegedly gave them a false name and a false ID. And officers testified that they recognized him from the wanted pictures. At that point, they had probable cause to arrest him. The arrest is important for two reasons. One, once someone is arrested, they can be searched incident to arrest, anything within their wingspan. So that's where the backpack comes in, where the 3D gun, the silencer, that notebook journal, it's been called the manifesto, were found. They can also conduct an inventory search pursuant to arrest. The other thing that an arrest triggers is the right to have the Miranda warnings be read to you. Before then, anything that Mangione said, if he was free to leave, if he wasn't under arrest, that's fine under the Fifth Amendment. That doesn't violate one's right to remain silent. It's only when there's a custodial interrogation and someone's under arrest, they have to have those Miranda rights given. So the timing of everything is critical in a case like this. That's why the defense is focused on arguments like, well, there were a lot of officers there. He wasn't free to leave. They're trying to move that arrest earlier in time to say that there was no probable cause and that the Miranda warnings were read too late.
It's interesting as all of this is unfolding, as we're still looking at this live vantage point outside of the courthouse. I appreciate you for breaking down the very latest, but what's going on right now inside that we have there from some of our partners there at Fox 5 is that the Pennsylvania officer, Joseph Detweiler, is currently testifying today about that confrontation that took place there in the McDonald's during the police manhunt. In fact, what we know is that the prosecutor at 11:24 a.m. asked if the case could be called for a recess from court, which the court granted, leading to the resumption of footage that was also shown from his body camera footage, revealing several officers inside of that McDonald's. Of course, cross-examination began just about an hour or so ago. I have to ask you, Neama, when we're diving into what's being said by this officer in court, what are some of the critical things that can come out of this that the prosecution may be able to use? And how critical also is that cross-examination by the defense?
Well, the critical evidence is what was seized from Mangione, the gun that was allegedly used in the murder, the silencer, and that journal that really identifies Mangione's motive, apparently, for committing this murder. I mean, that is critical evidence. If for some reason the defense is able to successfully get it suppressed or excluded because it was a warrantless search and seizure, that is a huge win for the defense. So, taking one step back, the Constitution obviously protects all of us from unreasonable searches and seizures, from having to incriminate ourselves. So if the police, they do something that violates the Constitution under the court's inherent power and the exclusionary rule, any evidence seized or any statements obtained in violation of those constitutional rights can't be admitted at trial. There are certain exceptions, of course. So that's why these pretrial hearings are critical. If those statements are tossed, then the prosecution has a lot less evidence to use in the case. Now, I'm not saying they still can't get a guilty verdict with the surveillance video, eyewitness testimony of the individual that was at the scene, the person holding the coffee, the e-bike that was used to flee the scene, and anything else that didn't really have to do with this incident and this initial stop and arrest in Pennsylvania and what Mangione said. But this is a critical hearing. So what the defense is trying to do is to argue that because of these violations, the statements by Mangione should be suppressed. And the statements are really important because you have those initial lies that we talked about, right? Any lie can come into evidence because that tends to show consciousness of guilt. And then after he was arrested, there were some statements that were allegedly made to corrections officers where Mangione said that he had the gun in his backpack and that he had a knife. Why is this important? Because even if those statements were made after the Miranda warnings were given and they weren't in response to an interrogation by police officers, they were just spontaneous statements. Those can be given and they don't violate Miranda. So you're seeing a lot of discussion right now on cross-examination where the defense is saying, is it reasonable that Mangione was just making these statements himself and he wasn't being questioned? That's where the defense is going right now, trying to attack the credibility of the officers in this case, saying, no, this was an arrest. This was a custodial interrogation. He had a right to remain silent. And he didn't make a knowing and voluntary waiver of that right. Even if those statements were made after the Miranda warnings were given, and they
all right, it does appear that we're having a few audio issues here behind the scenes, Neema, unfortunately, but we're still listening into you here as we're taking this look outside of the courthouse. And so I want to ask you about the judge in this case, Judge Carroll. There is a longtime jurist known for overseeing some of these high-profile trials. Is there anything that's unique about this one in particular that may make the discussion that goes on in the courtroom particularly interesting? Of course, the intense watching from the public on this case as well. But how does a judge kind of navigate a situation like this?
Well, the judge matters a lot because the judge is the referee, the umpire, whatever you want to use, but they're the gatekeeper of the evidence. One of their key roles is to decide under the rules of evidence, under our Constitution, what comes into the trial and what doesn't. So these types of hearings outside the presence of the jurors are critical because it may not just determine the outcome of the case, guilt or not guilty, but these are issues on appeal. And we know that at least in the federal case, this is a death penalty case, and there are mandatory state and federal appeals in these types of cases. So obviously, this is a unique case in that we're proceeding both in state court and in federal court. That's not common. And of course, the defense is arguing that that's improper, an entirely different set of arguments that they're making, particularly in the federal case. But I mean, the judge is critical because this is the type of ruling that can really make or break the case, especially for the defense here if the judge allows all this in.
It'll certainly be interesting, and I want to take you behind the scenes here on Live Now from Fox, just our watch with camera so you can see how everything is unfolding. And we certainly appreciate Neama Rahmani for being with us, our legal analyst. But I also want to point to another aspect of this conversation that's good here. I want to put this up on your screen. It's another vantage point that we have here in our newsroom. My thanks to my producer, Julianne, who's going to be showing you what we have going on right now on YouTube. It does appear that our shot is frozen here trying to show you, but we do have a poll question up in the chat saying, what legal questions do you have about the Luigi Mangione case? This is the perfect time if you are watching with us at home or if you're watching with us on the go. You can ask, we have Neama Rahmani here. He's our legal analyst. He can answer some of these questions as well. And so before we transition here, Neama, I have to ask you, one of the biggest pieces of this case that's unfolded over the last year is that those terrorism charges that were against Mangione have been dropped. Do you think that that's also impacting how this case is going with these sort of pretrial hearings also ongoing this week?
Absolutely. First of all, I got to say Julianne is the best. I love her.
She's the
But
best. She
yes,
is.
sometimes the best defense is a good offense. So what you see the defense attorneys here and good defense attorneys, and we're talking about Mark and Karen Agnifilo. And if that name sounds familiar, Mark Agnifilo was one of the lawyers in the Diddy case. Actually, the Diddy documentary that's coming out on Netflix today references a conversation that he had with Diddy. So he's a very well-known and very well-respected defense lawyer, not just there in New York City, but nationwide. And now he's jumped from one of the biggest trials that we've covered, you and I, Christina, to another of probably the biggest cases that are happening right now here in the United States. So previously, the defense filed a motion to dismiss the terrorism charges. Now, why is that important? And this is where each state's laws differ a little bit. Normally, in most states and in the federal system, if you kill someone intentionally with premeditation, that's first-degree murder. That means that you're going to get a life sentence without the possibility of parole, or in certain jurisdictions, in certain states, and in our federal system, you're eligible for the death penalty. In New York, though, it's a little bit different. Premeditation alone is not enough to get a mandatory life sentence without the possibility of parole and get first-degree murder. You need something more. So originally, prosecutors there, they charged terrorism, and they argued that Mangione killed Thompson because of some political belief. But terrorism requires something more. Terrorism requires either an intent to intimidate the public or to influence the government. And the defense very cleverly but successfully argued that because there was no evidence that Mangione shared this manifesto with anyone else, this was his personal animus and his personal belief and his personal dislike and distrust of the health insurance industry. And that was not enough for it to be terrorism because there was no intent to influence or intimidate. And the judge bought the argument and dismissed the terrorism charge. So that reduced first-degree murder to second-degree murder. Still a very serious charge there in New York, but it carries a potential sentence of 25 years to life, plus any enhancements, which means that even if Mangione is convicted stateside, he does have the possibility of parole if everything works out and the judge sentences him accordingly.
I'm glad you are starting to refer to that because we did get a good question into our chat as well. Our thanks to Michael Thomas. He asked this question to you, Neama. He wants to know, would it be wise to move the trial? Is that still on the table in this case as we're still in the pretrial hearings for Luigi Mangione?
Absolutely. Expect the defense to file a motion for a change of venue. So what the defense has done is they've really gone after Pam Bondi and some of the prosecutors, saying that because of the statements the prosecution is making, his extrajudicial statements outside the courtroom, they've tainted the jury pool, and it's difficult to find a fair and impartial jury. Now, the change of venue motion is really tough to win. They're routinely made by the defense, not because they actually expect it to have a chance of success, but they want to create issues on appeal. Now, for a change of venue motion to succeed, the defense needs to show that it's impossible to find a fair and impartial jury in that particular venue. But in today's age, with social media and traditional media like LiveNOW, everyone has seen the video of Luigi Mangione allegedly assassinating Brian Thompson in broad daylight in Midtown Manhattan. I mean, there's no place in New York, much less the country, where you could move this trial, where you would have jurors that would walk into that courtroom and say, wow, this is the first time I'm hearing about this case. That's why I expect the change of venue motion to be denied. But I still think it's a good defense strategy to get the prosecution to stop talking about the case outside the courtroom to prejudice the potential jurors.
It'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. And you're completely right, Neema. I understand what you're saying. It feels like that's something that we've seen from all angles. And so we have one last viewer question for you before we slide away for our final 2-minute commercial break of the hour. Thanks to my producer, Julianne. Once again, she printed this out for me. But again, we have another one saying, will they evaluate his mental state? And could that impact his sentence if that goes that way? Of course, we know that's a long way from now, as we haven't even gotten into the actual ins and outs of the trial in this case. But how does that mental evaluation look in a courtroom in a case like this?
That's a great question. There's no doubt that his mental state will come into play at the sentencing. So in the state case, obviously the judge is going to determine the sentence, assuming he's convicted. In the federal case, because it's a death penalty case, jurors are going to have to decide whether to sentence him to death. And for the prosecution to put him on death row, they have to convince 12 out of 12 jurors unanimously. And what the jurors are supposed to do in the penalty phase in a death penalty case is weigh the aggravating factors against the mitigating factors. So the aggravating factors would be the premeditation, the fact that Mangione apparently did this because of Thompson's role as a health insurance company executive. But a mitigating factor would be his mental state, any mental illness. The reason why he did this, if he suffered from some sort of disability, right? I mean, obviously, we don't know that much about Luigi Mangione. By all accounts, he's a very smart individual, came from a very successful family. But if there was some mental illness, it would absolutely play a role in the penalty phase. The question is, can the defense get it into the guilt phase? And the answer to that is usually not. To really present a successful insanity defense, the defense generally has to show, because of a mental disease or defect, the defendant didn't know right from wrong or the nature and consequences of his actions. That's a very high legal standard to meet, and it's tough to do so, especially for someone apparently as sophisticated and as smart as Luigi Mangione. I don't think a judge would allow that to come into the guilt phase of the case, but certainly something that they can consider in the penalty phase.
It'll certainly be something that we're continuing to watch, as, of course, this court case has really grabbed the nation's attention, as Luigi Mangione is accused of killing Brian Thompson nearly a year ago there on the streets of New York. Thanks to Neama Rahmani, as always, former federal prosecutor and legal analyst, for joining us to break down the very latest. Thanks so much, Neema.
Thanks, Christina.